It was known for a studio of mavericks. And of course, Orson Welles was a maverick. Writer, producer, actor, genius, radio superstar. It was obvious that Orson Welles would eventually come to Hollywood. He gained notoriety in this radio program about Martians attacking the Earth. And I just love this opening statement. Hysteria among radio listeners throughout the nation and actual panicky evacuations from sections of New York and New Jersey resulted from a too realistic radio broadcast last night describing a fictitious visitation of strange men from Mars. And this is the key for Orson Welles, is to take an existing form of entertainment and finding a way to change it. And of course, he made this feel like it was actually happening, and that hadn't been done before in a radio program, and it had absolute results that made him famous. So, RKO executive George Schaefer, in order to increase the prestige of the studio, gave Welles an unprecedented deal. Come to Hollywood, make a film, and you will have final cut. Now, final cut, if you don't know, means that every creative aspect that goes into Citizen Kane is going to be Orson Welles' decision. It would be unheard of to offer a first-time director uncut from the studio. And even today, there's only a handful of directors that enjoy the final cut privilege. If you've driven by Melrose, the original Rko Studio, which is now part of Paramount Studios, is still on the corner, and you can see the Earth Globe, which used to have a radio tower on it for RKO. And you can get a hamburger there if you wish as well. So, again, Citizen Kane. Everything about Citizen Kane is different, and it's kind of hard to appreciate it in today's perspective. But when it came out in 1942, it was really unlike any other film.
41.
Even the first image, the title of Citizen Kane, you would expect a music cue to be attached to the opening title of the picture. There's no music cue. Welles is going to do the opposite of what you expect, and that's one of the geniuses that Citizen Kane represents. In order to learn how to be a filmmaker, Welles needed to surround himself with experts that knew the various departments at RKO. And so he sought out different advice from people that he could work with, that wanted to work with him. And in some cases, he was able to work with staff and studio personnel that had ideas about filmmaking, but never had a chance to explore them. Because studios, pretty much at that time, made films a certain way, a certain studio style, and Welles wanted to change that. He worked with Robert Wise. This is a picture of a very young Robert Wise as an editor, and got along very well with him. And Wise, of course, would go on to be a famous director in his own right. But I just love this picture of being somebody who's had to work with directors in the past. He's obviously showing something to Welles, not making eye contact. Welles is upset in some way. I've been there many times. I know what this is. Welles also brought Bernard Herman, who he had worked with at CBS, to score his movie. And again, Welles starting to think about developing a style that's more of a fluid camera, sort of like a dream, would need music to kind of pull everything back together so that the narratives made sense. And so his collaboration with Bernard Herman is also an equally important contribution to the film. And of course, cinematographer Greg Tolan. Greg Tolan had this idea called pan focus. He was really interested in, again, changing the way that movies were made by creating more of an ensemble scene, meaning that most traditional films at the time would have close-ups, over the shoulders, the master, the cutaway. They designed shots so that they would play as an ensemble cast in front of the camera. The idea being that the audience could choose who they wanted to look at as a character was talking, instead of sort of being forced to observe an editorial style. And this was, again, a very effective way to make filmmaking different for Citizen Kane. Now in this shot, you'll see it later, of course, it's a long, beautiful pullback from the window. The characters in the foreground are discussing young Kane's future. And it's an incredible dolly shot that pulls back. And while you're watching it, you might notice this. It's like, how does this dolly pull back and then suddenly there's a table there with people? Because it would be in the way of the camera pulling back. And so the way they did it is, as the camera's pulling back, they're sliding the table under, and the people are sitting down just at the right moment to get that shot.
Wow.
Citizen Kane is filled with these kinds of great ideas. They also had a terrific visual effects department at RKO. And on the left is Linwood Dunn, who was sort of the optical guru at RKO. Lynn is often credited with inventing the optical printer. He didn't really do that, but he did take optical printing to new levels, creating new techniques that hadn't been done before. And here's a shot of the visual effects crew creating the famous RKO logo that would be at the beginning of every studio production. So in addition to the deep focus cinematography of Toland, Wells also relied on Linwood Dunn to create shots in the optical printer. Sometimes this would surpass the ability of a conventional lens to hold the extreme foreground and focus and the background. What's again amazing about this shot is that there is a visual narrative going on while the story is being told. You're not ever really told what the glass is in the foreground, but you obviously know what it is. Again, this idea of communicating through images versus just dialogue. And something like this, the foreground would be photographed separately against black, camera refocused to the background so that a hybrid of both images could be put together on the optical printer to create this shot. And then just briefly, another total favorite one of mine is of the broken snow globe. Again, ultimately you're photographing this shot, but what you want to do is then show a reflection of the nurse coming into the room. And so that's going to be added separately on the optical printer. So
Wow.
this is a picture of Linwood Dunn on the left and Vernon Walker, who was the studio visual effects department head at RKO. And so, you know, how does an optical printer work? And this is kind of a simple explanation, but basically an optical printer is a camera, you can see the camera there, with a lens that photographs the aperture of a projector. So tonight we're showing the film on a projector, but if we took that lens off the projector and put a camera to photograph the aperture, you can make a copy of that image. And once you make copies of that image, you can combine it with other images to create composite scenes. This is the optical department at RKO. Again, Linwood Dunn on the left, and I just love this because, you know, the way we do visual effects now, of course, is done with computers. This is a mechanical way of creating imagery. These machines were essentially built to create illusions for cinema, and were very complex and precise. It was also a struggle to use. You would have to kind of create shots several times until you got a satisfactory effect. One of the things that is a common staple in visual effects work is what's called a split screen. And this is a picture of Stuart Granger from The Prisoner of Zenda. And it's used, in this case, to play two different roles. So the actor can change costume and appear in the scene. And the way it's done is that there's a mat or a split that protects half of the frame during one piece of photography. Cameras reround, the mat goes to the other side, and then it's composited. But the actors have to stay on either side of the screen. The split is right through the center. Linwood Dunn came up with the idea of the traveling split screen, which means that on the optical printer, now that split screen doesn't have to stay where it is. It can move. Wells realized that with Dunn's technique, that he could then take shots that he had previously photographed and change them and add value to them through a visual effects process. So once Wells figured out how the optical printer worked, he had a close association with Dunn to create new imagery for his film. I have a little clip here explaining one of the shots of the Thatcher Library, and Linwood Dunn explains the technique in his own words. I've also created some animation to kind of help us understand what Dunn is talking about. I'll show that clip.
In the library with the statue there of Thatcher, they had no statue on the set, just pulled back from the lady sitting on the bench. You just saw the base of the statue. And Wells said, I want to be up on the statue. So I had a miniature built about 2 feet high, and I made a stationary shot of the miniature. And on the optical printer, made a mechanical pan off and a pan down to the scene that we already had with a traveling split screen, and brought it so it came down and back in one fell swoop. And it looks just like it was shot that way. When Wells came on the lot, this was one of his first experiences with motion pictures, and he had Robert Wise as a film editor and Mark Robeson was his assistant. They were very familiar with the optical printer. They liked and used it a lot. So they told Wells about it. He came over and took a look at it. From then on, Wells just used it, you might say, like a paintbrush.
So, countless amazing shots thought up in post-production by Wells when he realized that he could change his movie with an optical printer. The idea, of course, is that you could move off of a miniature or a matte painting and with the traveling split screen effect onto live action and then sometimes back again, hugely expanding the scope of your movie through a visual effects process that would be created in post-production. These interviews, by the way, I conducted with Linwood Dunn when I got to know him over time, and he was gracious enough to let me interview him. These haven't been shown to the public before. You're seeing them for the first time. In this shot, well, I'll let Mr. Dunn talk about it for himself.
There was a tremendous amount of work in Citizen Kane that was done after the picture was finished in post-production, taking existing scenes and changing them. For example, in the Opera House, when the camera goes up into the flies, Wells wanted it to go much higher. It didn't go that high on the set, and so we built a miniature and pieced the miniature in after it went up to a certain point and extended it, and then pieced that miniature into the shot up above with the two men looking down. And that worked out pretty well. We got so we could do those things pretty good.
So another major contributor to the visual effects of Citizen Kane was the matte painting department at Rko, comprised of Chesley Bonestell, Mario Larganaga, and Fitch Fulton. Xanadu, of course, was a construction, a fictitious place that didn't really exist. Obviously, I assume that that Mr. Hearst was not going to allow location shooting on San Simeon. So Xanadu had to be created through the use of matte painting. And you'll see, of course, this sequence, tour de force, matte painting visual effects sequence at the beginning of the film of the Xanadu mansion appearing as the camera floats and gets closer and closer and closer. And you'll notice that the window, which is where Kane's bedroom resides, stays in the same place throughout the montage sequence, adding value and attention to the ultimate destination of the camera. Another really fun shot was this hallway shot. Linwood Dunn told me that he always loved to work in the category of realism because that was the hardest to do. And so he was very proud of this shot and the work in Citizen Kane. Again, let's have a clip with Lynn talking about this shot and how it's put together.
Of course, you have two categories in special effects. Two basic categories is reality and fantasy. Now, fantasy is obvious fantasy. It's, King Kong's fantasy. There isn't a 20-foot gorilla. And the reality is the young unsung heroes do work with reality where you have made a marvelous shot out of various elements and the end product is pure reality. Well, in the doorway where Wells is way down the hall at the entrance to the house, he was shot separately, and that's all they had was the doorway. And then the area where Wells was standing was another part of the set, and in between was a painting.
Oh.
And even the reflection of Wells standing there on the floor, the reflection on the floor was painted in because he didn't move.
So Kane, for all its storytelling innovations, unfortunately was not successful on its initial release. It reported to have lost $160,000, which was actually quite a bit of money in 1942, and basically completely just disappeared from the scene after that initial release. It didn't really emerge until it was part of a library sold to TV in the 1950s from Rko and other films, again in their library. Of course, eventually it was rediscovered in Europe. Filmmakers and film students, they are sort of the reason why we get to see it today and how it's become recognized as a classic. So I could talk about Citizen Kane for another hour, but I think maybe we should just watch the movie. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and I hope you enjoy Citizen Kane.